We are talking about character tags today. And this is one that kind of goes hand in hand with character development and characterization, but it's something very specific. A character tag is a repetitive verbal device. And so, what we use character tags for is to identify a character very specifically, and then to use that tag again in our memoirs to oftentimes remind readers who that person is, but not exclusively. Sometimes it's more than a reminder. Sometimes it is about setting up that kind of verbal recognition, or it's a literary device, right? So that the reader sets that character in their mind in a particular way. So this can happen in a number of different ways, and I'm sure there are more than I'm going to list here, but I'm going to give some examples from some of the books that I reference often because I'm both because I'm familiar with them and because I love these books. But in Heavy, for instance, Kiese Lehman uses the full names of a lot of people in his book. If you all have noticed, even if you were to reread the first paragraph, or rather first chapter of Heavy, I actually pulled it out because he opens talking a lot about this woman, or rather a girl, named Beulah Buford. And when he talks about Beulah Buford, she over and over again is only referred to as her full name. So it says, and a lot about her house. But when he introduces her, he says, I was 12 years old, 3 years younger than Layla, who had the shiniest elbows, wettest eyes, and whitest feelers of any of us at Beulah Buford's house. And when he writes about Beulah Buford, she's the only one, not the only one in the book, but the only one in this context who gets her full name. And there's a reason for that. He wants Beulah to stand out in our minds in a way that is separate from other characters. And so again, it's a literary device, it's a choice. Uh, Many of you are familiar with Eat, Pray, Love, one of the most famous memoirs of all times. And Liz Gilbert also character tags a lot in that book. And one of the memorable ones, as many of you will probably remember, is Richard from Texas. Richard is never just Richard. And when she describes him, she gives him a lot of Texan characteristics. He's Texas through and through. But throughout the book, when she talks about Richard, he is Richard from Texas, and that is a character tag. It's repetitive. It's something that is used to both define him and for us to remember him in that context. And so in this way, Richard himself is connected to a place, that place being Texas, and that is the character tag in and of itself. People can also use character tags to talk about or to connect a character to something that happened to that character. So that's the case in Angela's Ashes with Uncle Pat Sheehan, if you guys remember him. This was Angela's brother who was dropped on his head when he was a boy. And so throughout the book, he keeps saying, oh, my uncle who was dropped on his head. And there will be all kinds of characterizations about him because he wasn't okay after that dropping. He has a soft spot on his head, and it's absolutely defining of who this uncle is. And so there's a line in which Frank McCourt says, I bring home the bread, and even if the abbot is surprised, he doesn't say, where did you get it? Because he was dropped on his head, and that knocks the curiosity out of you. So he uses that having been dropped on his head over and over and over again as a way to describe who this character is and to drive home for the reader. He's a very loving and lovable character, but he's simple. And he's an important character in the book, but we keep being reminded about this fact about him. Another way to do character tagging, and this is the final one that I have, example that I have for today, is euphemisms. And you guys might be drawn to euphemisms because you don't want to name someone. Perhaps you don't want to tell us who the person is. I've mentioned several times in this group how much I love You Can Make This Place Beautiful. I hope that you've all had a chance to read it. If you haven't, make it a holiday read. But what Maggie Smith does in this book is she doesn't want to name her husband. He cheated on her, and that's what the book is about. Their dissolving marriage. And so she uses all these euphemisms. I mean, she calls the husband, which is fine, but the woman that he cheats on with, the way that Maggie finds out about it is from a postcard that she finds. And so she calls the woman the addressee, which I like, the addressee on the postcard, and that is all she is in this book. I mean, she's a sort of their character, but we don't find out anything about her, which is appropriate. And then for herself, Maggie actually has a lot of names that she calls her own self, which I really like in memoir because we all are I this, I that, but it's a little bit of a poeticism or a way of falling out of the I to consider what Maggie has done. She calls herself the wife. She also calls herself the finder. She is the finder of the postcard because that is the seminal event, having found the postcard that basically destroys the marriage. But here's an interesting little section in Maggie's book. The section is called A Note on Character. The wife, the mother, the finder would love to be someone who doesn't give a fuck, or who at least gives considerably fewer fucks, but she is not that person. That's not how she was built. The wife's factory setting is GAF. She gives so many fucks, all the fucks. I really love that. And then she asks this question about the postcard. Sometimes I wonder if there had been no postcard, no notebook, would our marriage have survived? I don't know. That is the truth. So she's kind of building this idea of being the finder. And then I'll just share one final piece because it has a through thread. I mean, this goes throughout the book, and that's why I said this is a literary device and it is intentionally repetitive, like other things we've talked about. Later on in the book, it says, the finder has lost her narrative, but the play continues. In this scene, imagine that she sits beside the husband on the marriage counselor's love seat. They talk about the problem, the finder's work, her. Right. So she does a nice job of sometimes entering into that third person. And then the character tag for Maggie is something other than I, which, we would all, I think, experiment with. It's a nice thing to get out of your own, to get a little bit of distance from your own story. And particularly with something like this, when she's grappling with something really emotionally challenging, she's able to put some distance between, herself and some of the, betrayal that unfolds in this project, or rather this work of great memoir.